dastardly crime are you up to now, Dick Dastardly?
A foolproof way to win this wacky race. That's what.
And now, here they are. The most daredevil group of natty drivers to ever whirl their wheels in the wacky races. Competing for the title of the world's wackiest racer. As the wacky racers roar across the desert, dashing toward Hand Springs, Wyoming, the drivers are desperately trying to pass one another.
Pretty much all the Saturday morning stuff was superhero and action-adventure shows. And there was a lot of parents groups, I guess, that figured there was too much violence on television. So in the year the Wacky Races came out, they kind of went back to basics like slapstick comedy, more Roadrunner, Tom and Jerry type gags.
Dragged and double dragged.
The Hanna-Barbera stuff, when I was a kid, it was like the most polished out of all the productions that were being done at that time. I mean, the music was above par, the sound effects, the voice acting, it all kind of just came together as one solid package.
Saturday morning TV at that time for this studio, Hanna-Barbera Studios, was like the mother bird that was trying to feed that nest of newly hatched little birds, because TV was like just having all of these gaping mouths that you had to keep dropping shows into.
Just the amount of work that went through there at that time too was just, it was amazing that they got anything done, just with the schedules and how many episodes that they had to crank out. It's just amazing that they kept that level of quality up. It was like above and beyond anything that was being done at the time.
I've always looked at that as sort of an age of discovery in animation, where challenges were thrown at animators to come up with things that have never been thought of or tried before. The first thing that I remember hearing about was the fact that we were to create all of these characters with their cars. Then each week they would be involved in a race.
It was going to be more of a game where you had to send in who you thought was going to win the race every week or something like that.
And then there would be prizes given away for kids that would pick the winner. It was more of a game show than anything else. And of course, I think the powers that be stepped in and said, you can't do that. So anyway, it just became the show that it eventually evolved into.
You know, they did 17 half hours, and each half hour had 2 different cartoons. So, you know, that's what, 34 different races. And you have people like Iwo and Jerry designing this stuff, and you're not going to get anything bad anyway. They probably had 100 cars to choose from.
You had so many hands in this show. I mean, you get all those people in a room, and it's going to be pop culture of whatever was popular at that time.
With Wacky Races, I think there were a lot of things in movies that were sort of like that. So you had Frankenstein-like monsters racing alongside classic 1920s gangsters.
It's almost like they weren't trendsetters. They just kind of went along with what was going on. If it was a popular TV show, or if there was an aspect of the TV show that was popular at the time, they would take that and expand on it and just kind of give it a little bit more of a twist rather than just do it verbatim.
Hanna-Barbera always seemed to understand the importance of having distinctive vehicles. The Flintstones car, the Jetsons car. If you saw those without seeing any other characters or even a background, you'd know what show it was from because they were so unique.
The great thing about the Hanna-Barbera cartoons and the period of time that these shows were produced is that they utilized actors who were originally came from radio. And there's a big difference between a radio voice actor and an actor doing a voice.
Boy, did I have a good time. Only girl on that show. And all these wonderful actors. There were about 6 actors and 11 cars and about 15 or 20 voices.
They were doubling, tripling, quadrupling. They were doing many, many voices. And you'll see often an actor talking to himself.
I've seen film clips of Dawes Butler behind a microphone, and he'd do one voice and the other.
You know, you had somebody like Don Messick or Janet Waldo or Paul Winchell or any of those people that could do multiple voices, and it didn't sound like one person doing the same voice.
The actors were all very, very concerned because they all had a lot of voices to do, and they would do their homework. In other words, when we'd start the session, they would get off in a corner or even at the table, and they would practice their different voices like an orchestra tuning up.
They could do anything. I mean, they were just marvelous. And they not only would answer to the traditional feeling of a character, but they would be so inventive. They were as creative with an off the top of the head approach to a character as we might be in terms of how you designed the character.
We pulled out all the stops. We figured that it didn't matter because we weren't being photographed, so we just would go crazy.
To me, just in general, the Hanna-Barbera stable of voice actors was as important as the animation because they had to make the scripts work and creatively fill in if something wasn't animating a lot. They had the best voice talent of anybody, I think.
You're working with limited animation here. You can't do full-out facial expressions like you can in a feature film. You don't have the time, you don't have the money or the budget, so you rely a lot on the voice to bring across acting-wise whatever you can't do character-wise in the animation.
The Wacky Racers are off to a good start, folks. All except Dick Dastardly, who seems to be tied up at the moment. Drat!
Hanna-Barbera probably started using the narrator in Wacky Races because of the nature of the show itself. Because it was a race, and races generally have someone calling the race. And also, again, I think it probably had to do with the number of voice actors that they were using. It freed them from the characters having to give a lot of exposition that the narrator could do in a humorous way.
You always felt that the narrator was actually there watching the race or officiating the race, because every once in a while Dastardly would break that fourth wall and look right at the camera and start talking to the narrator.
Better watch out, Dick.
Why?
You're approaching the end of the bridge.
Huh? Yikes!
They were very smart to use a narrator in the show because, again, you're working with a limited budget and a limited time in animation. What the narrator did for this particular show is it moved the pace of the cartoon along.
And away they go on the way out Wacky Races.
Wacky Races title sequence was a really neat graphic take on it. Introduced all the cars. It's like 30 seconds. They just show the entire show right there. You heard that theme music, you heard the thing, you come running out of the kitchen with your bowl of cereal and you're there.
Jerry Eisenberg had just a natural feeling for what this show required.
Most of it just came out of my imagination as far as for the looks of the cars. You remember things that you've seen in the past, whether it's in a cartoon or a live-action movie. We always had books to look at for reference, maybe a little something would trigger a thought.
One of the things that makes the show interesting is the fact that these cars had a great deal of diverse looks and names.
Joe Barbera would come down to our room and pick the ones he liked. Sometimes he'd make a blend, He'd say, take a part of this one that someone did and part of this one that maybe someone else did and put it together. Originally, I designed a boulder mobile, like a car that looked like a big boulder with this one caveman sitting in it. And Joe liked it. But then he came back the next day, probably talked with his writers, maybe the network people. And he said, well, we'd like to have 2 cavemen in it. Let's make them the Slag Brothers.
Slag Brothers I loved because they were almost completely inarticulate and they just sit there whomping each other. Now, how great is it to ride around in a rock and just beat your brother on the head with a club, and go, ugga, ugga.
They just smack the other cars with their clubs, and when something wasn't working right, the car would break and pedal.
The Freaky Folk is losing traction on the ice, and Will Gruesome shifts to Dragon Power for a little flame action. It worked!
What I liked about the Creepy Coupe monster car is that they would shift into various gears on the dashboard there, and you might have dragon power.
I love the Gruesome Twosome. They were great. They had that big old dragon in the belfry, and whenever they needed to get ahead of somebody, the dragon would just sprout wings and off they'd fly.
This is one that Jerry and I sort of threw back and forth. Kept adding ideas, such as bats flying out of the belfry, that sort of thing.
The gags like that, whether they were written or whether they were just put in the storyboard stage, gags like that just made me howl in front of the TV.
Driver Pat Pending is always inventing. How about that bit? He's changed into a giant drill.
Professor Pat Pending in the converter car, he would shift into certain gears on his dashboard. It's the converter car, is exactly what it is. A car would convert itself into anything at the time that Professor Pat Pending needed. I've seen it turned into a vacuum cleaner. I've seen it turned into a hot air balloon. Whatever he needs to get away from Dastardly and try and win a race.
Pat Pending's car, you could never figure out it could do anything. You could just push a button and it change into a pogo stick.
He lacked the maliciousness of Dastardly, but he certainly had equal inventiveness when it came to using that to get an edge on somebody.